I'm Jessica Wilson, and you're listening to Making It Awkward. This episode is part 2 of my interview with Dr. Robert Lustig of UCSF. Part 1 of the episode aired 2 weeks ago. Thanks so much to those of you who sent voice memos, emails, for the phone calls, and Zoom calls after that episode. After the volume of feedback I got, I can tell that this will be an ongoing conversation. The coded language for race and class will be fully fleshed out during the episode on which I wrap up my 30 days of having 80% of my diet come from ultra-processed foods and how I felt physically overall. In today's episode, I could go point by point in my conversation with Lustig and say things like, Chef Boyardee is indeed fortified. But that would be petty. And I could talk about how nice it must be to not look at grocery store prices to know that a can of raviolis is actually $1.20 and a Trader Joe's salad is $6, but I won't. I also won't say that the idea that people in lower income areas have access to a Trader Joe's is both hilarious and horrific. Instead, I'll discuss some things in threads of our conversation and see if we can pull a lot of this together. I've learned not to debate academic research with clinical experience and outcomes. As Lustig said about his beliefs, quote, "The data that's come out has vindicated my position," end quote. I realize that Lustig and I do have something in common. He doesn't want me to speak to the general population, and I don't want him to either. We already get enough shaming and blaming messages about food. Another commonality is that Lustig and I both know that we've had positive clinical outcomes based on our interventions, and we both have colleagues who share our experiences. And Lustig and I exist in completely different universes in the same city. He believes mitochondrial fitness is the arbiter of whether somebody is healthy. I do not. As someone who has epilepsy, even if I take my mitochondria to the gym, on a run, and make them do yoga every day, I will never be healthy. I can't see how a researcher whose life and legacy requires the population to hold up health as a moral imperative would need mitochondrial fitness to be the focus, but that's just me. Lustig believes that if you don't have metabolic health, nothing else matters. And again, I simply do not agree. I think Kent said this beautifully in our last episode.
I would much rather have Bo have a gentle, connected relationship with the world and to have a fucked up metabolism.
There are common sentiments that folks shared and also something surprising. I'll discuss starvation and its connection to eugenics and address the comment about war. Starvation is a natural transition to a discussion about eating disorders. We'll then think for a second about who will be the ones to spend their time cooking meals from scratch, if that is what we're supposed to be doing as a society. I'll share what feedback I've gotten from listeners and from UCSF. And lastly, we'll get to the beginning of a conversation of how much of this is just another way people use elitist and academic language to reinforce the systems and structures this country was founded upon. To start, one content note for listeners I hadn't thought to include in the last episode was that the interview was mostly me trying to squeeze in questions where I could and direct the conversation back to something I'd asked 4 topics ago. That dynamic was something that many people found hard to listen to. I asked a friend in eating disorder recovery if the whole interview had been triggering for her, and she said yes, but because of the mansplaining and talking over me, not the food stuff. My interviewing style, composure, and patience were often noted in your feedback. And I had to sit with that for a bit because I wouldn't describe myself as a patient person. I describe myself as curious and calculated. In this call, my goal was to hear an expert who is regularly called upon to speak to the public and about what the public needs, show us how removed he is from the reality of the public. My goal was to hear the paternalism and patronizing language firsthand, not just read it in a policy. One piece of feedback that I did not expect was from a former neighbor of mine. He's now a doctor working at a children's hospital and gave me a call. He shared that the dynamic between me and Lustig was very similar to those he's had with kids who are extremely invested in sharing their special interests. he shared that the need of Lustig to share all the facts and railroading on ahead, regardless of where I tried to steer the conversation, was very similar to the urgency of kids on the spectrum who show you their Pokemon collection and tell you about it as long as you'll listen. That was truly something I hadn't thought about. I was so in the weeds and thinking about my patients. My old neighbor said it was good that Lustig had found a career for himself in which he could explore the minutiae of mitochondria for a living, as that seemed to be his passion. My phone call with my former neighbor also confirmed the absurdity of asking people who work in an ivory tower to create policy and tell the rest of us how to live our best lives. Lustig lives in San Francisco, per his website, and it would seem impossible that he not see the effects of failed policies to serve those most in need when he simply walks around the city. I wonder if he ever questions whether those creating policies are not the best fit for the job when he literally needs to walk around people sleeping on the street and past those asking for money to buy food. My old neighbor also reminded me not to make assumptions. In my exasperation, I mentioned that Lustig must have a wife who cooks all meals from scratch, because having a prolific academic career doesn't seem like it would lend itself to making family dinner every night. My former neighbor noted that we don't know anything about Lustig's life, and that he may be poly and in a furry community. And you know what? He's right. I don't know Lustig's life. What stuck with me most from the interview with Lustig was the endorsement of eating nothing when one doesn't have good food to eat, and that bad food kills people over a longer period of time, end quote. This pinged eugenics and ableism for me. It was a bit more than a century ago that eugenics gained traction among doctors and then the public as a biological science. It was towards the latter period of the Industrial Revolution. With the influx of immigrants, especially those from Southern Europe, and a lot of societal shifts, a few doctors proposed addressing poverty, alcoholism, mental health challenges, and crime through better breeding. They captured additional researchers, doctors, and then the public with the idea that old stock Americans should only marry and have children with the same. People were convinced that it was biology, via genes, not societal inequities, that were causing people to be poor, drink alcohol, and do sex work. The country was experiencing many changes, and eugenics was to be the solution to the public's discomfort. At the time, it was legal to institutionalize and sterilize people deemed to be, quote, unfit, as I would have been, due to my epilepsy. Sterilization was the primary tool to make sure these people didn't pass on their genes to further generations. In the PBS documentary, The Eugenics Crusade, historian Dr. Keith Wailoo of Princeton University noted that these doctors were trying to recreate society in their own image. And historian Dr. Daniel Kelves, professor emeritus at Yale, said that the eugenicists, most of whom were white, Protestant, and middle to upper class, quote, tended to equate human worth with the qualities that they themselves possessed, end quote. People who didn't fit the ideals of society were disposable, a burden, and not afforded humanity. These beliefs are what come to mind when I hear that eating nothing is the desired alternative when we cannot cook something from scratch or dine at a 4-star restaurant with tiny portions. The idea that eating processed food is bad because people live longer than they would if they starved and become a burden on society and the healthcare system is terrible alone, and also ableist. It applies to all of us with a disability or chronic illness as we rely more on healthcare than those who are non-disabled. And Lustig's comment about starvation ending wars made me curious about which war he believes he's fighting now and how starvation will end it. It could have been just a saying, but it got me thinking that in the 1910s, people felt like they were fighting a battle against a diversifying population and blaming individuals for systemic problems. And this is the same artificial us versus them war that we see in current conversations about a changing population in this country and across the globe. I was talking to my spouse about this. She studied wars in more detail than I, and she said, if we're not fed, we can't fight. People who are undernourished are less able to fight in physical battle, and I'd argue are less able to fight systemic forces of oppression. Keeping people in vulnerable situations by not meeting their basic needs like food and shelter is one way to maintain the social hierarchies that have been in place for centuries. Starvation ending a culture war is another way to fortify the social standing of those who are left. To transition to eating disorders, I will use my now favorite quote from a prominent eating disorder doctor who chose to remain anonymous. The idea that one should eat nothing rather than processed food is orthorexic fantasy, and I have no notes. I also got a voice memo about eating disorders.
Hi, Jessica. My name is Una Hansen, and I work primarily with parents and guardians of kids who have eating disorders. So I have a lot to say in response to that conversation that you shared, and I'm going to focus my thoughts here today on this particular population that I work with. It was pretty disappointing to hear the doctor share what I see as a really outdated understanding of anorexia, reducing it to a body image disorder, when we have very clear evidence that a young person, or really someone of any age getting into energy deficit, can develop an eating disorder, and that their symptoms of starvation historically were mistaken for the causes of the eating disorder. And it sounds like this doctor really hasn't gotten up to date on some of that. And the idea that an NG tube is the only way to nourish someone back to health from an eating disorder is just really, really upsetting. And I think about the parents that I work with every day who are renourishing their child, often thanks to things like highly caloric, high sugar, low fiber, calorie dense foods, lots of fats. Obviously, he seems okay with fats, or at least some of them. But also processed foods, right? Things that are really easy to eat, things that are predictable, things that are affordable for families to get that calorie density in to help their child recover. And as you said, parents are the easiest group to sway. And I've seen the way this kind of messaging has really hindered kids' recovery when parents are afraid to give their starving child foods that the child can tolerate. And it can really delay someone's recovery. It's so painful to watch, and also so wonderful to watch the way parents really listen to their intuition and realize, wow, my kid really needs this food. This is actually the healthiest thing for them to be doing right now. And tuning out the noise of some of these, researchers and policymakers who, I guess, are just really out of touch with what so many people are going through in their relationship with food and their access to food. So thank you again for sharing this conversation with us. And I can't wait to hear your thoughts as well. Thanks. Bye.
This voice memo pairs perfectly with another comment from the same eating disorder doctor previously mentioned. The idea that the starvation of anorexia nervosa and the starvation of not eating anything in order to avoid processed foods are different is another fantasy. Starvation is starvation as far as the body is concerned. It doesn't know motive. It just knows when it isn't getting what it needs in terms of proteins, fats, and carbs to fuel its daily processes. We know this from every possible direction scientifically. For instance, those with relative energy deficiency in sport have identical physiology to those with anorexia nervosa. And those with relative energy deficiency in sport don't have any psychological drive for thinness or body distortion. They just happen to not fuel enough. For me, as someone who has seen how life-changing and life-giving processed foods have been in my patients' and friends' eating disorder recovery, it just becomes more clear that Lustig and his colleagues' work is meant for institutions and not for the public. It also illustrates the need for those of us doing the work with patients to be the ones deciding on public policy. Thank you to everyone who shared how important processed food was and continues to be in your eating disorder recovery. I hope that these episodes have been helpful for you as you learn about who is truly defining what healthy eating in this country looks like. We still haven't addressed the realities of people who are not food insecure. Middle and upper class folks regularly eat foods that likely fall under the category of what Lustig would label, quote, bad. Middle and upper class people still feed their kids Lunchables because it's what their kids will eat. Under capitalism's 40-plus hour work week, plus commutes and side hustles just to pay bills, I don't know a world in which every meal and snack doesn't contain an added salt, corn-based additive, or natural flavor. Processed foods make it possible for so many of us to eat during the day. Not having to cook each meal from scratch makes it possible for us to meet the additional demands in life and also relax. I heard from many parents how much additional labor and time it would add to their days to cook each family meal from raw ingredients. And as our roles in society continue to be gendered, it would likely be the more femme member in a partnership to step into the role of family chef should all processed food be cleared from grocery store shelves. And I also don't want to live a life where my food only comes from scratch or a 4-star restaurant. My main priority when making several choices each day is not going to be mitochondrial fitness. Eating only for mitochondrial fitness is like having sex only for procreation. We are more than biological organisms. We deserve joy, pleasure, and to not feel shame. Additionally, this notion of going without and eating half a Trader Joe's salad a day, that are the cornerstones of today's anti-fatness and wellness culture. And now I'll read some excerpts from emails that folks sent in. Danielle says, the stress of carrying guilt and shame placed on me by wellness culture, and more specifically my coworkers at a naturopathic clinic focusing on optimizing wellness, was far more unhealthy for me than the, quote, unhealthy processed food I eat now. Incidentally, the fertility issues and chronic pain that were presumably the result of my eating habits and lifestyle choices suddenly resolved after leaving my job, in spite of eating more sugar and processed food and exercising less. Leshu says, the most useful aspect of what he said was to demonstrate how profoundly out of touch he is. It also shows how divorced so much certain food science is from the lived realities many people inhabit. To view no food in the context of wars alone, and otherwise to advise it, tells me he has never been food insecure or experienced food apartheid. But if he is so proud of himself for seeing how intertwined everything is, he should be focused on radical structural change, not individual habits. Kara shared her thoughts. I wish medicine could be as simple as he pretends it is, except we are caring for humans, not robots. Being right is not better than being a compassionate realist. Also, no wonder trust in physicians is at an all-time low. It is clear he does not recognize the harm he perpetuates. And modern medicine can do heroic things, but we are largely missing the entire fucking point of healing. Adrian said, thank you for this interview. I'm a community dietitian and have focused on nutrition access and security for most of my career, at a food bank for several years and at the state level for older adult nutrition. We wear two hats, food security and nutrition. And in my corner of the field, food first is always the way to go. The number of times I've heard doctors say out of touch, elitist, racist nutrition-related opinions about what people eat and why are too many to count. Thanks again to those who emailed their feedback. And then the feedback from UCSF has varied widely. The School of Medicine replied by pretty much saying to keep them out of it. Quote, Dr. Lustig is an emeritus professor who retired from UCSF in 2017. It was a one-sentence email reply, and I'm here for it. I did write a brief reply that said that emeritus was nowhere to be seen on UCSF's and Lustig's personal website. The UCSF dietetic internship got back to me with, the program has explicit discussions on social determinants of health and food access, and we teach our interns to optimize and/or maintain intake based on the foods and cooking facilities an individual has available. We also work closely with our social work colleagues to refer patients to community nutrition programs for support around therapeutic diets. And I also reached out to a few of Lustig's colleagues. I emailed his fellow sugar scientist, Dr. Kirsten Bibbins Domingo, professor of medicine and of epidemiology and biostatistics at UCSF. She's also the vice dean for population health and health equity in the UCSF School of Medicine. I emailed asking how she sees Lustig's research and the overall idea of starvation align with health equity, but I haven't yet heard back. I reached out to another of Lustig's academic colleagues and got a very long email response that was similar to my interview. It was very much a share all of the facts and my analysis email. I'll share some excerpts that make it clear that Lustig is not alone. Quote, "So whereas Dr. Lustig is right, and that a person eating a single salad with chicken per day is likely to be better off than a person eating more calories, but only by including processed foods in the diet on a daily basis, it is very difficult for a person who is hungry to limit him, her, themselves to just that one meal." He goes on to say that, quote, "If we tell people to skip the processed food, we may be telling them to go hungry for prolonged periods of time. That is an aversive feeling, and most people are unable to tolerate that. So this is a fundamental caveat to the notion of avoidance as a solution to the processed food tragedy in our country." End quote. The idea that people should be able to tolerate the denial of a basic need is wild and says so much about someone's lacking ability to see the humanity in someone who is food insecure. Something that this researcher and Lustig seem to miss is that oftentimes when people don't eat, they just stop feeling hunger. It's as simple as talking to someone who didn't grow up eating breakfast, regardless of food insecurity, who just isn't hungry for it now. We see it in folks with restrictive eating disorders who just don't get hunger cues anymore. I see it in my friends and patients with a history of chronic dieting. The physiology of hunger, restriction, and starvation is far more complex than insulin and leptin. The same researcher then makes me a list. First, the power of marketing makes it very hard for a person to feel confident in skipping meals or avoiding processed foods. Cost is another factor. People need to ration limited funds for shelter, cell phone connectivity, and food. They will therefore compromise by eating unhealthy foods, especially if they also have to use that food to feed others beyond just themselves. Another factor is agency. Many people who are disenfranchised in our society simply do not feel that they deserve to eat what educated and wealthy people eat. I'm pausing to take a breath here because, yes, you did hear that. He goes on, educated people with means can eat unprocessed, even organic foods and also ensure that they get variety. For people without means or education, the only way to get any variety is to eat processed or even pre-prepared foods. There are many other societal and psychological factors that impede the ideal situation as well. So in the end, whereas the biological benefit of unprocessed foods is clear, there is a lot that goes into why people eat unhealthy foods and why it is exceptionally difficult to get them to stop doing this. Wow. He then offered consultation because he applies this with his patients. And I just cannot even imagine what his dynamic with patients is like. And also I can, because I hear about it from my patients who develop disordered eating as children and adults. That is to say, I hear it after they've avoided coming to my office for months or even years after sitting through appointments with providers like these. Do I doubt that people have felt supported by this researcher? No. I'm sure that he sees what he thinks to be successes all the time. And I wonder if those patients are the same patients who Lustig sees and dine at 4-star restaurants and report back that they're full after a couple bites of food. But I don't know for sure. I don't know this man's life. Again, the need to maintain an othering dynamic and sustaining an us versus them is clear with the second doctor. There are those who know and those who do not know. And we pity those who don't know. We tell them what they need because we know. This dynamic gets repeated in policy. Patrilli Hernandez had this to say on public policy.
So the Capillary Food Bank pairs up with another anti-hunger policy organization to release their State of Hunger report, and it was just released last week. We are at a 20-year high for people responding yes to not knowing where their next meal comes from. 30%, over a third of people in the Washington, D.C. area are struggling with food insecurity. I think the one comment outside of all of that I think struck me the most, because it hit home for me, when you were describing somebody, I think it was somebody that has access to a can of ravioli.
Yeah.
And he replied with, having eggs and bacon.
Yes.
As an alternative. And you saying, well, what if this person doesn't have access to make this? And he said, oh, we're going down to that level.
Yeah.
Does he understand that level, the number of Americans that are faced with that decision? We are in a period in our country where more people are experiencing crisis as a response to the pandemic, right? Housing, security, food insecurity, medical and healthcare security. Down to that level, like, it made it seem like he was just, we're just talking about, no, like, there are, this affects more people than you think. And when we're talking about 30% in the DC area, when it was about, before the pandemic, it ranged anywhere from like 17 to 22. In 2020, the number drastically dropped, thankfully, because like community solutions, government solutions were in full force. All that got cut off in 2022, and we're worse off than we were prior to the pandemic. Right? Like, this is not a small number of people. 30% is not a small number of people.
Yeah. And it's not like he's calling in from some weird, like, Beverly Hills situation.
Right. San Francisco, right?
Yeah. He stepped outside in San Francisco and had to step over someone who was literally on the sidewalk. It's wild.
So I guess I'm just wondering, right? Like, where do we go from here?
She asks a very hard question. We can see how policy solutions that focus on marketing of fast food and taxing soda don't actually solve societal problems in the end. Basic needs cannot be addressed with regressive taxes. The maintenance of a social hierarchy requires those in power to not put energy and resources into policies to address the actual problem. Among these researchers, we don't see conversations about universal basic income, universal health care, free college tuition, supporting workers' unions, forgiving student loans, tax reform, and investing in communities to end food apartheid. These things could level out society. When we hear from researchers directly, we can start to put together who and what these public health policies are truly for. As part of the public, we can do multiple things at the same time. We can know that direct support today is important, and that there is work to do to address the root of the problem. That work takes time and is worth it. Next week, I'll share how I fared with my month of eating mostly bad foods, and I'll check in with Amy about anything that stood out to her in this conversation. We'll also go back to race and class. Thanks again to everyone who's provided feedback thus far. You can still send it to makingitawkwardpod@gmail.com. Until next time, make it awkward. This has been an episode of Making It Awkward. I've been your host, Jessica Wilson. This podcast is sponsored by Sacramento Outboard Services. It is edited and mixed by the fabulous Jen Jacobs.